Okay, thank you everybody, and welcome to the 2022 New York State Political Science Association panel for American and International Politics. And I was speaking to you prior to the beginning, and we just stated there was originally kind of supposed to be two panels due to some presenters who were unable to make it. I'm going to combine the panels into two. And just very briefly about myself, my name is David Pompoulos. I am a graduate of SUNY Empire State College. I graduated, seems like a long time ago, with a Bachelor of Science in American History and Political Science. And I went on to SUNY Brockport for a master's degree in American History, and then returned to SUNY Empire State for a second master's in Social and Public Policy. And I'm about halfway through doctoral studies. And I'm really excited to be here with you all today. And we have a lot of really interesting papers, interesting topics. I read all of your papers more than once. So we have Anderson Miles. Anderson is presenting on his title is A Threat to Democracy. It's about the January 6th protests in Washington, D.C. David Burns is presenting on Britain's exit from the European Union, examining the impact of that on trade. We also have, and if I mispronounce anybody's name, please let me know. Sarah Berlinger, she's looking at the causes for disparities in arrest and conviction rates between African Americans and Caucasian people. And then Ty Prescott Salako. Did I mispronounce that? Salako, I'm sorry. Ty Prescott Salako, who examined the Hong Kong protests. Our title is titled "Leaving It to China: How the International Community Responded to the 2019 Hong Kong Protests." So what I'd like to do is it looks like we have really two, and of course, if we do have one other presenter, Cameron, if he's able to join us, it presented a paper on judicial review, looking at the judicial review process and the Constitution. So we have really two papers on American politics and three on international. And because I want to give Cameron some time, hopefully his computer pulls up here, we'll start with the international politics panel with the international group. And we can go right ahead and start with, let's see, one moment. Let's go ahead and start with David Burns, Britain's exit from the European Union and its negative impact on trade. And while you are presenting, if I'm not looking right at the cameras, because I'm taking notes and such. So David, the floor is yours.
Okay, I have a PowerPoint. I'll try to do that. Okay, do you guys see it?
Yes, thank you.
Fantastic. All right, my name's David Burns. I'm with SUNY Buffalo, and my paper is Brexit and the impact on trade relations with the UK. Brexit. Brexit is short for Britain's exiting of the EU. The history of Brexit, the UK has been a member of the European Community, and which later became the European Union since 1973. So there were many factors to consider in separating, including how the UK and the EU will live, work, and trade together. My research is in trade. In June 2016, the UK voters voted to leave the EU by a 52% margin. In March 2017 began a 2-year countdown, which turned out to be 4.5 years from vote to implementation. My hypothesis is the more negative a country's perception of the European Union is, the more likely the state will have a strong trade relations with the UK post-Brexit. For my dependent variable, I looked at the UK import relations with other countries using World Trade statistics. For my independent variable, I used the country's perception of the EU via Pew Research survey I found. My first control variable is geographic proximity. It was a binary. I coded 1 for Europe and 0 if not, thinking that the closer a country is, there are better opportunities for trade. And then I looked at the country's openness to trade as a percentage of GDP through the World Bank data, and figured the more open to trade, the more likely they would want to have trade deals with the UK. And then again, I looked at the regime type, validity for, and figuring the more democratic a state is, the more likely it is to form trade deals with like-minded democracies. My unit of analysis was cross-sectional, and I used an ordinal logistics regression. As you can see, although an unfavorable perception of the EU had no statistical effect on trade relations with the UK, it was a positive relationship. The trade as a percentage of GDP had no statistical effect, and there was a negative relationship. And whether the country was in Europe or not, the geographical proximities also had no significant relations. Finally, when comparing the regime type, there was no real significant relation, but it wasn't positive. Possible reasons for not being able to get a good hold on my variables was that I did this thing in 2021, just as Brexit was being finalized. It was a fairly unique study, and I couldn't find most of the studies I found were based on before Brexit and how Brexit would pan out. And obviously Brexit had not been implemented for very long, and most trade agreements were still being negotiated. Currently, I'm looking at my dependent variable is still import relations with other country, but I'm looking at import and exports in pounds from state to state, from individual states to Britain, using the Office of National Statistics data. And then I found a Europa survey that asked, would you say that Brexit is a good thing or a bad thing for the European Union? And also, did the UK make the right choice by voting to leave the EU? And then I took the geographical proximity, and I actually compiled actual miles between capital cities and London, instead of using a binary variable. And then now I have actual trade deals that have been made since Brexit. So I'm looking into that, and I'm keeping the regime type. Thank you, Dr. Iacobucci, Dr. Squari, Buffalo State College, Political Science Department, and the New York State Political Society Association.
Okay, thank you very much. And very interesting, both presentation and paper. And as I stated earlier on, we're going to go ahead and do all the presentations, and then we will go through sort of paper by paper for a brief discussion. But David, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, next we have Ty Prescott-Sulaco, whose paper is looking at how the international community responded to the 2019 Hong Kong protests. Ty.
Hello, I'm going to share
Hello.
my screen real quick in my PowerPoint.
Great, sure.
You guys see this?
Yes.
Okay, great. So I'm gonna start my timer real quick just to make sure, I'm not taking up too much time. So hello, my name is Ty. My paper is called Leaving It to China, How the International Community Responded to the 2019 Hong Kong Protests. And what I'm researching is if China's wealth and influence over the international community had any effect on how these nations responded. And I also attend Buffalo State. So, oh my gosh, not jumping to the third PowerPoint. Okay. A bit of background info. So in the 1840s, during the Opium War, China had leased Hong Kong over to the British. At that time, Europe was was in Asia a lot, and they were trying to get a lot of resources. They were newly discovering parts of Asia. And so China leased over Hong Kong to the British. And then about 50 years later, 50 plus years later, I should say, July 1st, 1898, they decided Hong Kong and China and the British that they were going to leave Hong Kong under British rule for 99 years, which would be until 1997. And then Hong Kong would be returned back to China to perform as a semi-autonomous nation under China until 50 years later in 2047, which would be when they completely merged back under China as a Chinese state, which is why currently it's called the one country, two systems, because Hong Kong is currently under China as a state, but they run under two systems as it is semi-autonomous. Hong Kong being under British rule did change a lot of its environment. And when I mean that, I mean its social and governmental environment. They do act, Hong Kong acts more as a democratic, what many may call a Western-like nation, because they were under British rule for so long. They follow a lot of British methods of education, lifestyle, etc. So the separation between Hong Kong and China did create a lot of rifts between the societies, between the governments. And now that Hong Kong is back under China, there is an issue of people feeling mainland China is imposing its government onto Hong Kong's semi-autonomous government. As they want to move more democratically, the mainland Chinese government may say, hey, we want to implement these policies over the nation currently. So what were the protests? In summer of 2019, Hong Kong saw its largest anti-government and pro-democracy protest in its history. So there was a policy mainland China decided they wanted to implement, which is an extradition policy. And they said in the extradition policy, anybody who does anything criminal in Hong Kong can be extradited into mainland China to be charged and or, jailed, justice system, etc. The issue with that is that because they have such different governments, such different social issues, something that may not be illegal in Hong Kong, speaking about something about people, is maybe illegal in mainland China. And the issue the people have is that imposing on our freedom of speech, of our freedom of movement. And they were afraid, me speaking in my own land could get me taken somewhere else in jail. So millions of people came out to protest. It was incredibly large and it quickly fell apart. Not the protests, but the peace. There was a lot of peace at first. It was very quiet, but then police were sent in by, not only the Hong Kong police were sent in, but mainland Chinese police were sent in, military, to basically shut down the protests. And that became very violent. The people were getting attacked. There were a lot of human rights abuses in play. So because of that, the world stage was like, okay, that's not all right. You cannot attack people. The police cannot be attacking people. That's human rights abuses. Many nations were forced to make a statement about it because they wanted some acknowledgement for what was happening to the people of Hong Kong. So that's what I'm researching. What effect does China's influence over the international sphere have over the kind of responses that were given? And I'm going to go into the kind of responses that were given. So my theory was China's wealth and influence may have an impact in the way foreign states have responded to the protests in Hong Kong. Some nations may be too afraid to make a strong sentiment. They're taking a lot of aid and funding from China, while other nations may want to use this as a way to make an example out of China. This isn't okay. This is what we stand. It's very interesting. So I had three hypotheses. The amount of aid and influence China has over a nation directly correlates with the severity of their statement. That could be true. Hypothesis 2 was the amount of aid and influence China has over a nation doesn't correlate with the severity of their statement. And hypothesis 3 was the amount of influence and aid China has over a nation somewhat correlates with the response, but there may be more important factors. And I had a quick legend here, but I'm not going to go through it for time's sake, but just in case anyone wanted to know how I was going about it. And so to list my responses, there were 4 different responses, how I categorized them. So there was a neutral response, which is very few nations took that. They basically said, we don't want any involvement. We don't even want to speak on it. Hungary took this by attempting to block the European Union from making an official statement on any of the actions. They didn't want to be involved at all whatsoever. Singapore took a different approach. They acknowledged that the protests could be harmful on both sides, but they feel like it's an issue of sovereignty and it's an issue for over there. There was also an absence of response. Over 60 nations did not make a response at all. And that's a majority of countries in the world actually didn't make a response at all. And in 2019, there were a lot of protests, not just in Hong Kong, but worldwide, a lot of political brutality. And so, many of the nations on the did not make a statement list also were on the list of nations who were having a lot of political issues that same year. So that could be correlated, but we're not sure. And then there were two very specific agreements. These are the other two, so this is four. So there was the reference to previous agreements, the German, which I consider the German statement, they had 39 signatures and they were saying, they referenced the Sino-British Joint Declaration, which says, while they're a semi-autonomous nation, no one should impose on their free speech and their freedom of autonomy, which the German statement and the 39 signatures were saying, hey, we do feel like this is imposing on their freedoms and this is wrong. While the Pakistan statement they said this should be non-interference. Hong Kong issues are Chinese issues and therefore leave it to China. That is a China issue and we should leave them to handle it however they want. Although they also did mention there are legitimate rights and freedoms of Hong Kong residents and they should be respected. And here's a quick list of the signatures. I'm not going to go through them, but you can see there were 39 on one side, 54 on the other. And it was quite interesting to see who was where. And so I ran my statistical results. And according to my table, I'm just going to read my results out to you guys. According to my table, the debt, so I split it up into 4 variables. So debt to China could have an impact on how the nation's response, also their regime type, if they have a similar regime type or a different regime type, the strength of their economy could be why, a lot of these nations are borrowing a lot of money from China. They're getting a lot of aid, so that could be impactful. And the geographical proximity, if they're closer, if they're farther, that may have an impact. According to Table 1, debt to China had no statistical effect on the severity of the response towards the protests in Hong Kong, although the variable is in a positive direction. There are quite a few countries that do not report the amount of aid they have received from China, and many countries do not report the amount of aid or deals they make under the table at all. So the data there is a bit empty. Many studies conclude that over half of the funds received from China go unreported. The regime type, measured by polity score of a country, had no statistical effect, and the variable was going in a negative direction. Although many nations have polity score, many nations do not, so the data there also was a bit empty. And the strength of the economy did not have a statistical effect at all. Sorry, I'm trying to say statistical, your tongue gets heavy. It had no statistical impact on the severity of the response, most likely because most countries, regardless of the economic strength, did not make a response at all. In the remaining nations, it seems there was a mix of strong and weak economies in each response type. So you really can't determine what made what causational. And then finally, the geographic proximity had no statistical impact. Nations, regardless of location, had varying responses. And there are many nations who have similar geographical proximities to China, but had very different responses to the issue. So that was quite interesting. A lot of them had no significance, but also a lot of the data was missing. So moving forward, in conclusion, China's relationships with other nations did not have a significant impact on how states responded to the Hong Kong protests based on the data I found. Although there is ample evidence of states being indebted and reliant on China for a lot of financial aid and occasional protection, there is not enough evidence set in fact because many, if not most, of the transactions and agreements China has inked with other nations have gone undocumented and under the table. Because of that, there's not nearly enough information to confirm my theory. Moving forward, I hope to research if there's any way to find more information about the under the table agreements and the silent aid a lot of nations are getting to try and make more sense of where the missing data is. And more extensively, I would like to research what's going on within the nations that did not make a response because it seemed like they were having quite the year as well. And that's all from me. Sorry if I was talking a bit fast.
No, not at all. Thank you, Ty. That was really interesting. And I'm looking forward to the sort of after presentation discussion where we can come back then and talk about your paper and David's paper as well. And let me see. Cameron, you're on. You're with us now? I just want to make sure you can hear me. If you can, just go ahead and unmute yourself. I see your name there in the list. I just want to make sure that everything is up and running and working for you.
Yeah, so my computer
Perfect.
is completely busted, so I had to use my iPad.
Okay.
So I don't have access to anything, but I can
That's
still
okay.
talk about my paper.
That's okay, no problem. Like I always say, technology is great when it decides to work, right? All right. So let's so good. I'm glad you're with us. So now, so as far as the presentations on sort of the international side, that wraps up the international point of view. So we're going to sort of switch gears over to the American politics perspective, and we'll start with Sarah Berlinger, who's looking at the causes for disparities in arrest and conviction rates between African Americans and Caucasians. Sarah.
Sorry, I forgot to unmute myself. If you hear anything in the background, my neighbors just have some like construction going on, so that's all that is. But I am presenting arrest disparities between African Americans and Caucasians in the United States. Okay. So I decided to include my literature just to kind of give an idea of what kind of drove my research in the direction that it did. So my first school of thought was demographic, and this just included gender, age, and race. And the basic idea in this school of thought was that all of the authors agreed that race played a major role in arrest disparities. And some referenced even the possibility that it can that it overlaps into age and gender as well. My second school of thought was recidivism, which is the tendency of a convicted offender to reoffend. And the basic idea in this school of thought was that policies like three-strike laws disproportionately hurt minorities. My third school of thought was socioeconomic status. And in here, I looked at income and family dynamic. And the basic idea of this was that income played a significant role in the cause of arrest disparities, and that family dynamic also could play a major role in it. And then my fourth and final school of thought was implicit bias, which is the stereotypes or attitudes that affect our understanding, actions, and decisions in an unconscious manner. The basic idea of this was that there's an underlying reason as to why people of color are more likely to be arrested than their Caucasian counterparts. And just for like an overall, all of the literature authors agree that there is a disparity in arrests and criminal justice system interactions between African Americans and Caucasians, but they differ on what is the main cause for said disparities other than race. So I had two hypotheses. My first one is when looking at arrest rates, African Americans are more likely to be arrested than their Caucasian counterparts. Major factors contributing to this being income, recidivism, and implicit bias. And this was simply just kind of looking for whether there was an arrest disparity and the major cause for it, and if there were any major causes for it. And then my second one was when looking at arrest rates, income should be a major factor of influence in African American arrests. And this one I chose to specifically look at income because quite a bit of the literature, even if income wasn't the main reason the author said for arrest disparities, it all kind of came back to income. So I wanted to see if I would be able to find if I would be able to find that that was true based off of the literature. So for my methodology, my dependent variables were African American and Caucasian arrests. And I got that data from the FBI, the Census Bureau, the World Population Review, and the Harvard Implicit Bias Project. And then the statistical model that I used was a multivariate linear regression. So the first model is total population and percent of arrests for African Americans and Caucasians. This model was statistically significant with a moderate strength relationship. And then for the variable results, only percent arrest for African American was found to be statistically significant. The percent of arrest for Caucasians was not found to be statistically significant. And I think that this result shows that as population increases, the percent of African Americans arrested also increased, but that same relationship wasn't found for Caucasian arrests. My second model was African American arrest rates and recidivism, income, and implicit bias. Again, this model was statistically significant with a very strong, and it was a very strong relationship. For the variables, implicit bias and income were found to be statistically significant, but recidivism was not. And then by looking at the beta coefficients for the two statistically significant variables, it was you can see that implicit bias was actually the variable that had the greatest effect on African American arrest rates. And then my final model was Caucasian arrest rates and recidivism, income, and implicit bias. And this model was also statistically significant with a moderate strength relationship. And in this one, recidivism was the only variable that was statistically significant at 95% certainty. But if you lowered the percent certainty to 94%, then income was also statistically significant. So I decided to do that to kind of include income. Implicit bias was not statistically significant. And then by looking at the beta coefficients of the two statistically significant variables, recidivism had the greatest impact on Caucasian arrest rates. So just to kind of reiterate everything, my first hypothesis was proven true. The first model showed that as total population increased, African American arrest rates increased, and this relationship was not found among Caucasian arrest rates. And it was also proven that implicit bias and income have major impacts on African American arrest rates, but it wasn't proven that recidivism does, but I'll explain about that a little bit later. And then my second hypothesis was also proven true. Even though implicit bias had the greatest impact on African American arrest rates, if you look at the beta coefficient of implicit bias and income, there's a difference, but it's still close enough to kind of say that income still had a major influence on African American arrest rates. Just to go back to relate it to the literature, I think that my results supported my hypotheses as well as the literature, and the results support what was claimed in the literature, that there is an arrest disparity, and it proved some of the causes like income and implicit bias as being causes for that. And then just some flaws in my research. A lot of my data I collected relied on self-reporting. So they were not complete data sets based off of states, but I did try and choose the year that had the most counties in each state kind of reporting at once. And another thing was not everything I identified as a cause was measured for. So things like family dynamic, gender, age, those weren't really measured for. They were just kind of already included in the data, and I didn't create a separate measure for it. And then the last thing being that The implicit bias data and the recidivism data was only based on state level. It was just state. It wasn't broken down by race, gender, or anything like that. I don't know if that data exists, but it definitely might change the results if it does. How do I stop sharing? Oh.
Okay, thank you, Sarah. Very interesting. And again, I do have, once we go back through and start going through some of these papers, I have a couple follow-up questions for you. I really enjoyed that. Thank you. And let's see, up next, Cameron Gellert, who's looking at judicial review and the Constitution. Cameron, the floor is yours.
So I guess I'm just gonna have to do this lecture base today. I had a
That's okay.
PowerPoint, but life had other things in mind.
That's all right.
So yeah, so my abstract is looking over judicial review, but mainly, so the title is Let's Keep the Constitution Judicial Review, a bipartisan committee to monitor interpretation by the Supreme Court. So judicial review has often been considered the inalienable power of the court. Although it's not explicitly stated in the Constitution, it is noted, it is implied in Federalist Number 78 by Alexander Hamilton that the courts, wherever they are, whatever court, which he was at the time, basing a lot of this off English common law, that courts have the implied nature, the power to interpret the law. That's their duty because, for example, like today, there's nothing about cyber security, there's nothing about cars or anything like that in the Constitution. So when you're getting to constitutional issues on these things, you're going to have to use interpretation or else we can't move forward on anything. And within Federalist Number 78, we get this term guardians of the Constitution. So the judicial branch is seen as the final last protection for the Constitution. And as a branch, they're considered to be the weakest because they don't control the money and they don't control war. So this was kind of the rationale of why we needed this Supreme Court system to the anti-federalists that were had a bit of anxiety about it. So a lot of the literature when I studied this that I saw about judicial review, because I was mainly concerned not necessarily about judicial activism where a judge or justice uses their own personal bias and will manipulate the law to imply something that they want to see, but also just things where they make, where I'm interested when judges or justices just make honestly erroneous errors in interpretation, which kind of sounds weird, like how can you interpret something wrong? Well, there are ways when you can interpret it best, most properly, and then there are ways when you can kind of, you're not looking at the whole story. So that's mainly why I wanted to look at, and there's a lot of history on judicial review. The earliest goes back to Federalist Number 78, Marbury versus Madison, where Chief Justice John Marshall really solidified judicial review as a power of the court and set that precedent. But I really was curious more so about how can we possibly keep the Supreme Court as pure as possible. So my argument is a bit ideological, and my professor had all kinds of fun with this paper. So I think we need review of judicial review. So my thesis states, the Supreme Court must follow the Supremacy Clause within Article 6 of the Constitution when interpreting law, and to ensure this is followed, there must be a bipartisan federal commission within the judiciary that will review rulings to determine their constitutional basis. So at first, this appears that we're adding another block, that we're making the court not independent, which is actually one of the best things about the court, and that's what's mentioned so much in Federalist Number 78. However, this won't actually affect the independency of the Supreme Court. The goal I had with envisioning something like this to ever happen is that by having this bipartisan commission of legal scholars that are appointed in a similar way to that Supreme Court justices are by Democrats and Republicans, would be that they can analyze justices' opinions as well as their dissents to see how they got there. Because what really prompted me to want to do this was I'm probably saying the name wrong, but Chiavallo v. Washington. So that was the court case where the Supreme Court unanimously decided that states can punish faithless electors. So if an elector to the Electoral College, say their votes were promised to Joe Biden, that's where the state won, and he voted for Donald Trump, he could be punished with fines or whatever the state had decided. While I think on some ways, we didn't hear much about that because, of course, Democrats and Republicans want that in the legislature because they want to make sure that their candidate is going to get in if they're promised those votes. However, that's ignoring a lot of the US Constitution about the Electoral College because we were never set up to be a pure democracy form of government. We were always set to be a Republican form of government, which in a lot of ways there's elitism within that, but there were a lot of bulwarks made towards just the people straight electing the president. And Justice Kagan, who penned her opinion, she appealed to things like popular opinion. So VP with Julia and Dreyfus, Hamilton, which, I mean, great shows, but I don't think that belongs in any kind of Supreme Court decision. So that's kind of what prompted me to do this, because it's not that this commission will tell the Supreme Court how they need to decide what's wrong or right. They're just going to look at how a justice got there. They're going to look at, hey, you only looked at the Constitution, federal law, and international treaties that the US is party to. So that's pretty much all that's under the Supremacy Clause. However, and they start using things that aren't that, like personal basis, things that aren't even relevant to the Constitution, which I think some things like the Federalist Papers, although they in themselves are not authoritative, they are a commentary on the Constitution. So I think that is important to still use to help interpret the meaning of the Constitution. So while it shouldn't be stated that Federalist number 78 is law, because it's not, it can be used to help explain things about the court, which is in this Constitution, which is important. So this commission would essentially just be maintaining the public image, because I think modern times right now, we have this huge worry about the efficacy of the court, if it's legitimate, because Donald Trump was able to appoint 3 candidates. So there's a lot of people, or 3 justices. So there's a lot of people that are nervous about that. Biden has just now appointed one. Roe v. Wade is extremely controversial because many people are worried that it's not going to be looked at fairly from a constitutional perspective. It's going to be looked at from personal religious perspectives. So while I personally think our Supreme Court is always pretty great and that we have very little to worry about, I have a lot of confidence. I think having this commission would be able to show the people in more layman's terms that, hey, this is how the justices got there. This is the information they presented, they used. We didn't find any discrepancies from the parameters laid down in Article 6. I think that'd be helpful in maintaining a positive public image. And that's kind of the goal of this, because if the court doesn't maintain a positive image, then it's not going to be as effective as it should be. And then we'd have to rely on the legislative and executive branches purely, which wouldn't be great because they're political, whereas the Supreme Court is inherently nonpartisan and in a way apolitical, as in not searching for more power. So kind of an ideological argument, but my argument kind of is the court's been changed before. I don't see why there can't be another change that's not actually going to change how the court works. It's just going to add something to add more commentary and public image. And if we can make something more perfect, then why not to? So that's the basis of my argument. Sorry, I didn't have a PowerPoint to go along with it.
No problem. Thank you, Cameron. I enjoyed your paper very much, as well as your presentation, and especially taking into consideration technical difficulties. It's hard when you have something planned that you want to deliver and then life just doesn't work out that way. So you adapted really well, and I really enjoyed that. Thank you. And last but not least, our final presentation, Anderson Miles, who is looking at the January 6th insurrection at the Capitol, and examining if there is or has been any type of legitimacy in violent protest movements. Anderson, go right ahead. I look forward to hearing your presentation.
Thank you very much. Let me just pull up the PowerPoint real quick. There we go. All right, can you guys all see this? Okay. So
Yes.
let me just, okay. I apologize, I'm a little nervous here, but we're gonna give it a go, trial by fire. So a threat to democracy, examining legitimacy of violent protest. So on January 6th of 2021, the Capitol was under siege by right-wing protesters. One of the groups in attendance was the Oath Keepers, and this is a conservative militia that is mostly based out in the Midwest, but has chapters all around the country. And they believe in the constitutional oath that first responders are supposed to take. So from military to paramedics take this oath, and it's to protect and uphold the Constitution. And when the January 6th, when the president called to protest the election outside of the Capitol, they took that as a call to arms and stormed it. And it got me thinking at this time, in a democratic society, at what point do we allow for violent protest? I mean, democracies are set up to inherently be a voice of the people. I mean, look at it this way. You have an entire system, an electoral college dedicated to collecting the vote of the people and processing that and synthesizing that to produce the candidate and the election of a candidate to represent you in government. So for my argument in this, I argued that violent protest in democratic society is only justified if there is strong evidence to suggest that the democratic institution has failed. Now, for my literature review, I had to look at two groups: peaceful protesters and violent protesters / revolutionaries. So Martin Luther King Jr. in his letter to a Birmingham jail suggests that for protesters to get their agenda across and accepted, they have to disrupt the social norms of society. And in doing so, in disrupting the social norms of society, we can bring people to the negotiating table. Now, Frances Fox Piven, a New York State social scientist, suggests something a little bit different. She suggests that on a local level isn't enough, that we should be going after the coalitions and political parties. Now, what are coalitions? Coalitions are a number of different interest groups in a political party that help to form the agenda through compromise. Now, what happens is when there is a disagreement within that interest group or the coalition, there becomes a fracture, kind of like if you break a bone. So what a protest group is to do is disrupt that coalition, break it apart, and the politicians are forced to repair the bone of the political party, because without it, they won't get reelected for next year's election cycle. So bringing them to the fold is believed to help. Now, Gene Sharp is a political theorist on mainly dictatorships, but this is where it's kind of interesting. In a system where there isn't a democratic institution, like a legislator or elected representatives, it comes down to what Sharp calls the four pillars of dictatorship: the military, police, the intelligentsia, and last but not least, pop culture. Now, military and police are designed to protect the dictatorship and regulate its laws, make sure that everything's enforced. The intelligentsia, or educators, academics, what have you, are peddling the information that the dictatorship gives them, educating the youth of tomorrow so they'll follow with the curriculum. And then pop culture, if you think to the Oscars, it's pretty much this. It's the Chris Rock slap. That is what pop culture is. It has been memed. It is all over the place, and everyone knows of it. If I said it, and I already saw some of you smile like, oh, he said that. That is because that is ingrained. We all know it. We all can see it. Now, moving on, we have violent protesters, revolutionaries. Malcolm X, the rival of Martin Luther King, was a firm believer in defending self-defense in protest, because when you think about the time that this took place, Malcolm X down south was dealing with the Ku Klux Klan and the police force that would not protect him from the Ku Klux Klan. On top of that, you had the Vietnam War raging, and they were sending African-American men to fight in the war, but they were fighting for a country that would not fight for them. So that is why he said that African-Americans or protesters in general need to quite literally fight for their rights to survive sometimes. Now, going back about a couple hundred years, we have John Locke, and John Locke's whole theory can be broken down to this. If the social contract is broken between government and the people, then unfortunately, they will have to overthrow the legislator. Now, we could argue, well, Anderson, they could just be talking about the peaceful transition of power, but that at the time did not exist during the Enlightenment. It was a relatively new idea, and you had kings. So it was more likely representing rebellion than it was peaceful transition. And Immanuel Kant is only on here because, in the most honest, brutal way I can put it, he didn't know what he was talking about. Kantianism suggests that we should respect authority no matter the consequences. But in the same paper that he wrote on the French Revolution, he states that, well, you should respect authority, but if the authority is overthrown by revolutionaries, then the people, then the old government cannot overthrow the new government. And lastly, we have Walter Benjamin, a political scientist out of Germany during the Industrial Revolution, and he believed that there was two types of violence: mythic, and there was divine. Mythic violence is the violence that the people can use against their government or anyone, and divine violence is the ability of monopolized violence by the state to deal with problems for the people. Now, divine violence is not likely to be used against the state because the state controls it. They wouldn't use it on themselves. So some people may have to take into their own hands through mythic violence to overthrow what they deem to be a dictatorship. So to understand protest groups, we have to understand, well, to understand the Oath Keeper protest group, we had to understand other protest groups. So we have the Weatherman Underground, and the commonality between these two people is that they both attacked the Capitol. So in the late 1960s, early 1970s, the Weatherman Underground, a liberal terrorist organization, bombed the Senate chamber to send a clear-cut signal to the Senate and the United States government that as global citizens, we should not be involved in the Vietnam War and expand on imperialist America's agenda. Now, the difference between the Oath Keepers and the Weathermen is this: it's ideology. The Oath Keepers, in storming the Capitol, were trying to protect a sacred tradition of the election they believed had been compromised. The Weatherman Underground believed, as global citizens, that we had a larger job to do for the world community. So it comes down to conservatism within one's nation, and a world ideology, a more worldly ideology, was liberal interpretation. Next, we have the Oath Keepers of Westboro Baptist, both conservative groups by nature. If you ever heard of Snyder v. Phelps, that is where the Westboro Baptist group really gets their name from. So what had happened was the Westboro Baptist Church believes that the Iraq War was caused by God hating the United States for allowing LGBTQA rights to exist. They are very anti-LGBTQA and used the Iraq War as a scapegoat for that, to push their agenda. Now, morally reprehensible we could argue morally reprehensibly, it was wrong for them to be outside of the soldiers' internment. But we're here today to talk about the method in which they protested their view. Now, they protested in the case of Snyder v. Phelps. They were on a lawn outside of the graveyard. They did not attack. They did not threaten anyone's lives. The Oath Keepers went into the Capitol, stormed the Senate chamber, were rapping on the doors of the congressional chamber and threatening to take people hostage and potentially killing them, congressmen, in the heart of our nation's capital. So a peaceful conservative group can't exist. And the last group I want to look back to is a peaceful protest group or peaceful protests, I should say, in Greensboro, North Carolina. So in Greensboro, North Carolina, a lot of the diners were segregated by race, African Americans on one side, white Caucasian on the other. And instead of throwing a riot over this, what these students did was they sat at the counters and were insulted and attacked by locals. As you can see in some of the pictures, they're dumping drinks on them. Some are yelling at them, most likely racial slurs, and basically demeaning them and marginalizing them. And the difference is with violence in this circumstances, they come as victims and not as aggressors. Making yourself the victim of a situation, which is not a bad thing, it's a great thing, because clearly there is a problem in society where we have to separate, where we think we have to separate true groups of people. And through taking this humiliation, degradation, they alerted hundreds of other people who saw this and said to themselves, there's something wrong here. And if they had not done it, if they had just attacked it, would have been like, oh, well, this is just clearly another violent radical going at it again. So in doing so, we were able to show that violence can be used to make a movement go forward without physical injury. The Oath Keepers, again, were aggressors, and there has not been a good painted light of the situation painted since. So to conclude, violent protests in a democratic society is only justified if there is strong evidence to suggest it has failed. The Oath Keepers should be condemned for their actions, and more peaceful means of protest should be looked at in the future for protest groups. Thank you for your time.
Okay, thank you, Anderson. That was very interesting. And again, I'm looking forward to coming back and discussing this in a little bit more detail. So first, before we just kind of, and I don't want to take up too much of anybody's time. I know it's a Saturday and everybody's busy, but I do think the topics that were written about were really well done, and each one deserves a little bit more exploration. So I'd just like to take a few minutes to go ahead and discuss with each one of the presenters your papers. So we can just go back to sort of the beginning. I'll go in the order in which we presented, starting with one moment, with David's paper on Brexit, Britain's exit from the European Union. David, so you made what struck me as being really interesting about your paper is the title. So the title of your paper was looking at Britain's exit from the European Union and its negative impact on trade, which I found first to be interesting, because then as sort of the paper unfolded, and this kind of came through in your presentation. Exactly, how long, again, if you just kind of remind the group, has Britain now been separated from the European Union?
It's been 2 years. It was December 31st, 2020.
Yeah, about 2 years. So my question is, do you think within that 2 years, that's really enough time to really be able to step back and look at what the negative impact of trade has been?
No, I was more looking into the knee-jerk reaction, the original what happened, what's
Yep.
going to happen in the future. Is it's eventually going to balance out, obviously.
Sure. Yeah, and that's what I found to be really interesting about your papers, because the title is looking at the negative impact of trade or the negative impact on trade regarding Britain's exit from the European Union. But as your paper unfolded, you really were looking at an examination of what the different countries' views of the European Union are, and how and to what degree that would correlate with their trade with Britain, right? So then to use that as some sort of guideline or a framework to be able to make some sort of general prediction regarding what that impact on trade would be. And your based on the title of your paper, do you think that long term that the impact is going to be negative? You just kind of said it'll balance out. How do you see it going?
I really am not sure. I mean, I've been, like I said, I got the actual numbers from import and export, and you can definitely see a dip at the 2019, 2020. So I would assume that it would, it depends on, a lot of it is like the financial market, because Britain is such a big financial, and the EU is trying to get everybody to go into Paris as opposed to London. So there's going to be ramifications either way.
Mm-hmm. And there are some, I've heard some sort of criticisms of those who feared Britain leaving the European Union, saying that there was sort of this worst case scenario outlook, and that it really isn't going to have the negative impact that maybe some of those who opposed Britain's leaving the European Union would. Do you have a position on that? Do you believe that down the line we're going to really see some severe negative impacts?
I don't think, I do see that down the line, it may, like I said, it may balance out that, you know, but like the Brexit was a knee-jerk reaction. The vote to leave the Brexit was a knee-jerk reaction.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was just looking at the knee-jerk reaction post-Brexit.
Yeah, and that's interesting because, yeah, as far as and I think you stated this in your paper. Yeah, you did state this in your paper that, you know, once the vote had occurred for Britain to leave the European Union, one of the top Google searches is, what is Brexit, right? And the implication there especially is maybe even people voting on it had no idea, right, what it really meant. And that was really interesting. That I really like that you pointed that out in your paper, because there's always, and I think you're right on, there's going to be consequences. We might not know the extent yet, but there's going to be consequences, especially in sort of knee-jerk reactions to policies that maybe people don't really fully understand, right? And it seemed to me that that was sort of the main thrust of your paper, and not so much, as your title implied, that looking at the negative impact on trade, but really, right, can we to some degree predict what may happen? And let's take a look at, as you put it, the knee-jerk reactions to the vote and then the post-vote. So that would really be, your paper was really well done. I liked how you, and this is the case for everybody. I think I was really impressed reading your papers, looking at the way you stated in your papers what your hypotheses were, your independent variables, your dependent variables, what type of study you were doing, all of you, and we're very methodological on that. David, same thing, very impressive. I didn't feel like your paper and your I was expecting one thing when I read the title, and I got something what I thought was actually a much more enjoyable topic after, right? Which is very interesting, because it's too early. We don't know unless there are other examples in from the past of something similar that maybe you might be able to do a comparative study on. We have things like, I don't know, maybe you could look at it from a NAFTA, North American Free Trade Agreement, those sorts of things, what the dynamics are there compared to the EU, and maybe you can do a comparative study if that's where you want to go. But the focus of your paper and the title, just fix that title to match your paper, and maybe take a look at it, see if there's some sort of comparative study you could do. But that was really well done, and your presentation was really good. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Okay, and then I think next we had Ty. Yeah, Ty Prescott Salako. I hope I pronounced your name right that time.
Good.
I did. Okay. So you're looking at, again, the Hong Kong protests, right? And what I found to be interesting about your paper, that really struck me were a few things. There were a few good standouts. First of all, your honesty about the reporting of the data and how it was incomplete. So really, and there's nothing wrong with this, you really couldn't answer your question, right? Not to the, or at least not to the degree that you wanted, but some interesting other results came out. One thing that you pointed out, and a couple things, you said that over 60 nations had no response at all. That's interesting. Also, you stated that Hungary was the only, I believe you said the only country to take a completely neutral stance on the Hong Kong protests. As I was reading that, and I'm just curious to see what your point of view is here, I couldn't help but think of, with the exception of taking in a few refugees, Hungary's position on the Ukrainian or the Russian invasion of Ukraine, right? Um, is that based on your research with the Hong Kong protests? Was that maybe a stance that we could have foreseen coming from Hungary, given the current geopolitical situation?
No,
No.
not at
Okay.
all. Especially not for me. I think because I wouldn't even say Ukraine is a unique situation, but it seems to be a message of European nations sticking together, because if it were any other nation, I don't think, like if it was Hong Kong protesters trying to move out quickly to Hungary, it wouldn't have moved as fast. So
Right.
yeah, I wouldn't have seen that from them at all.
Yeah. Okay. And so it was one other interesting um, thing that floated up to the surface here was you stated that debt or aid to China, there was not necessarily a significant impact on how those countries responded. And a lot of that you attribute again to incomplete data, countries not fully reporting either how much debt they receive from China or aid given. So my question then is, based on your research, do you have any ideas as far as what did impact the responses? Because now we know what didn't, right? But what did? Did anything come out of that?
I believe, for me, it's still two things. I still do believe aid was a factor. I just think we don't have enough information to prove it. And then I also believe nations' relationships with each other was a big factor, maybe not with China in particular, but nations who were closer in contact with Pakistan, like Morocco. Morocco's closer in contact with Kenya. Kenya's closer in contact with Nigeria. They would stick together and they said, okay, we'll sign your documents since, you know, we're your friends and you say that it's okay, so we're going to say it's okay too. Same with Germany's close to the UK, which is closer to America, which is closer to France, and we're their friends, so we're going to sign their document because we feel like that makes the most sense. So I definitely think it was a matter of relationships and a matter of who felt the most pressure to speak. I think a lot of these nations felt really pressure. A lot of the nations who didn't make statements also weren't getting the same amount of pressure as the UK or as Germany or as Egypt were to make a statement.
So, so in other words, what you're saying isn't just to make sure that I'm understanding, geopolitical relations matter. Countries can play an influence on each other and how they respond to geopolitical issues, such as the Hong Kong protests, or as we're seeing now, the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Also, it seems like institutions matter. In other words, you stated that the United Nations sort of had a combined response, right? You specifically pointed out Germany and all the nations that signed on. So the way these sort of institutional allegiances play out, more so, even if things like debt and aid impact the way that institutions play an important role. And your paper, there was actually somewhat of a thread in both yours and David's paper that align with a lot of the other papers here, and that is the legitimacy of institutions, institutional legitimacy, right? David, you're looking at the EU, Britain's exit. Ty, your paper did not specifically focus on institutions, but that seems in your conclusions to play an important role. So that's another sort of way you could think about your paper is what are the effects and impacts of international institutions and how do those shape the views of the country's responses to to the Hong Kong protests. And my final question for you is, getting back this idea of the incomplete data. Again, you stating that you still believe that aid plays a part, and I'm inclined to agree with you. If you give me money, I'm going to be on. I'm
Yeah.
more likely to be on your side, right? But how would you, going forward, do you have any ideas as far as how you could follow up that research? In other words, what additional research could be done to really try to nail down that topic?
So from what the research I did before, the reason I found the information about the aid period is that there's a list of how much aid China gives a nation. Like they'll show it. They gave them $1 billion this year, $1 billion that year, $1 billion this year. But I think maybe we should look less into the dollar amount and more into the relationships China's building with some of these nations. China's in, and I don't want to bug out and say the wrong country, but some of the nations that they're in, they're creating schools and airports and a whole bunch of things that not necessarily come with, are not necessarily a dollar amount, but we're helping build their infrastructure, which I know a lot of people are about that, but for me, it's a good thing. If there are children going to school, if there are children eating, if there are children learning 2-3 languages at a time, I think that's great. But also, if you come into my house and build me a couch, I'm gonna stick beside you because that was nice. And I really think if we look more into the less monetary relationships and the more, oh, we're building a bridge, the China-Africa bridge we're seeing being built, that may be where we're gonna look next. Hey, what are the social relationships we're building,
Mhm.
the infrastructure we're building, rather than just how much money have you handed me today.
So in other words, and I was kind of hoping you would go down this path, perhaps more than financial support, we can all agree, I think, is important, but maybe more important is um, cultural influence,
Yes.
right? Um, and so that's another lens you could use to look at the severity of your response, right? To what degree does cultural influence of one nation onto another impact response? David could even take a look at that point of view if he's looking at trade through the European Union, right? Is there some, and the way nations viewed Brexit as being either positive or negative, is there a cultural influence? We know there's a long history of British colonization, right? What is that? How does that play into effect and tie? Same going for you, right? That cultural influence. What's more important, finances or culture, right? But your paper was really enjoyable to read. I loved the honesty you had in your paper, where you said, "Look, the evidence is actually disconfirming some of my hypotheses here, and the data is incomplete." You'll never go wrong with being honest. And when those sorts of things happen, what you just want to do is find a different lens to view your problem, and I think you'll find your answer.
Thank
So
you.
thank you. Sarah, there's quite a bit to talk about. You tackled a very appropriate and timely subject, right? Especially when viewing the events that have taken place, really since forever, but really kind of being brought back into the forefront within these last couple of years. And you were looking at, the differences between arrest and conviction rates, and the disparities between Black citizens and Black Americans and their Caucasian counterparts. So I had a question for you.
Okay.
You had, actually, I have a couple questions. So you stated in your paper,
Mhm.
one of the most critical variables in these disparities is implicit bias.
Mhm.
So my question is, you defined implicit bias as really operating sort of more on an unconscious or subconscious level.
Right.
So how do you measure that?
So I actually got the data from the Harvard implicit bias program that they have. They have the test that you can take. So the data that I got based on that was purely based off of, like, when you take it, you kind of fill some stuff in, you say what state you're from, and then they collect that data and they take an average of every score from every single state. So that's kind of, I got the average score from every state, and it was some, like, the higher the score, the more likely you are to have an implicit bias, and then the lower, the less likely you are. So it was an average of people taking the tests from each state.
Okay, understood. Okay.
Mhm.
All right. And so there was also something that you had that you said was that regarding regarding recidivism, which I think that seemed to constantly sort of come up as a key point in your paper. And I can see why,
Right.
because the recidivism creates a feedback loop, right? If you're already operating
Right.
within a system where um, the arrest and conviction rate is higher, then of
Mhm.
course that recidivism and it plays right into it, right? People getting
Mhm.
out of prison and going right back in, which again creates a feedback loop within the family, right? Broken
Mhm.
families, it's impossible to create that stable family unit. So now what you've done is you've created an entire system based on
Mhm.
keeping families broken and putting people in
Mhm.
jail. Something that you said though, you said that, and I was just wondering if you could maybe elaborate on this. It's you stated that as far as recidivism goes, it had the greatest impact on Caucasian arrests. I wasn't quite sure what you meant on that. If you could just explain that.
So I found that, I don't have the data right in front of me, but if I remember correctly, I think it actually, recidivism might have had almost a positive impact on Caucasian arrests. Um, so it kind of, if you were white and you got arrested, then and if you did reoffend, I think it was saying you're less likely to reoffend again. So like after like a certain point, you stop, recidivism kind of stops the reoffending. Like after a while, they stop reoffending.
Do we know why that is?
I had some stuff on Caucasian arrest rates and stuff like that, but most of the time it kind of just was just like, this is kind of how it is. And I was like,
Okay.
okay, like that
Because
works. If anything, like just based off of like all the research I did, I think it might have something to do with income more than anything. Depending on where you live, just geographically, that depends on your income. But but in some of the literature, it indicated that Caucasians have a better chance at being able to get out of the cycle, because either they have family members who are wealthier, or they live in an area where there are programs that help pull them out of the cycle, rather than in an African American community. You don't always find that.
yeah, and the other thing that kind of popped into my head, of course, was as you were speaking is, well, if the let's say first offender arrest and conviction rate is that much disproportionate in Black communities than
Mhm.
white, is it that white um, former prisoners upon release, is it really that they're not reoffending, or that they're just not facing rearrest or reconviction at the same rates
Mhm.
as their Black counterparts, right?
Mhm.
So again, getting back to that bias, right, within
Mhm.
the system. Now, you also you also stated the importance of family dynamic
Mhm.
and income
Mhm.
as important variables in understanding the disproportionate arrest and conviction rates in Black communities. But you also stated that scholars really kind of disagree. They agree that there's disproportionate arrest and conviction, right? But they disagree
Mhm.
on the variables. To what degree do the scholars discuss the importance of socioeconomic status and family dynamic? Is there any type of
So
consensus on that?
So income was more of they all kind of generally agreed on that. They all decided that if you go to prison, your income gets affected. If you're from a lower income area, you are more like your chances of getting arrested are higher. What they kind of disagreed on was income within the family dynamic. So I found one study where they talked about single family households and about how that income can play a part in it. But they found that in some instances, family dynamic was played a part in increasing arrest rates, and then at other times it didn't. But it also depended on the income of those single family, like single parent families. So it was kind of mismatched, like kind of mashed together a little bit, where they disagreed that family dynamic was a consistent cause of arrest disparities, but they kind of merged on the idea that income was always going to have an impact, but family dynamic was a little bit different because there are a lot of other factors that can play into family dynamic.
Okay. Yeah, and so it's interesting because there's this sort of spider web of causation that's causing the disparity, right, between
Mhm,
the arrest and conviction rate in the Black community versus the white community, right? And
mhm,
so it almost seems as what you're saying is where the weight leans, we don't know yet. There's all these different
yeah.
causes and conditions. And so if that's the case, because again, we could argue that as you just kind of did, economics is critical in arrest and conviction rate, right? Um,
Mhm.
so then by solving the poverty issue, do we solve the prison issue, right? The disproportionate prison issue.
Mhm.
Or are there other routes we need to go down?
So what I found a lot of in the literature when um, answers were being offered for something like that, it was you have to fix the socioeconomic nature that that a lot of African Americans find themselves in,
Mhm,
because once you fix that, then the stereotypes that are held against them that implicit bias kind of works on
mhm.
can no longer be accurate. So then once you address the income, then you can address the underlying issues that you can address the underlying biases that are there, because then they're no longer there's no way to accurately be like, well, you can just say that's not true. Like that doesn't happen. So
Mhm.
it's kind of like you fix the income, then you can kind of move on, or the other way around, you fix the issue with implicit bias and then you can fix the issue with income, because those two were it's like income, implicit bias are like the center of the web, and then everything just kind of like connects to them and goes out, and it's all interconnected. So
Mhm.
once you start talking about one, you end up somewhere completely different than from where you normally start talking about it.
Yeah, yeah, and your paper again, it's interesting because though you're looking at arrest and conviction disparities, honestly, the backbone of your paper fits in nicely with everybody else's because again, we've kind of gone back to this issue of either institutional legitimacy or what are the problems with the institutions that we have, right? In this case, you're talking about our legal system as an institution or the prison system as an institution, right? Which provides a really interesting segue into our last two presenters because again, these are all sort of connected. So thank you very much, Sarah. And I'm going to actually probably briefly come back to all of you a little bit later on as we finish out this discussion because your papers, even though they don't seem like they're connected, there are all these commonalities running through them, including yours, Sarah. So thank you. And so Cameron, we were just discussing with Sarah about the arrest and conviction disparities, right, within the African American community compared to the Caucasian communities. And your paper kind of gets, again, almost to the heart of that issue because you're talking about constitutional review, right? Judicial review. I'm sorry, you're talking about judicial review within the Constitution. And it was interesting reading your paper because it seemed like it was more of a polemic or an advocacy piece, right? You're already looking at, okay, the issue is problems of personal ideology playing into judicial rulings. and you're advocating for some sort of bipartisan commission, right, to oversee that. Would you say that's kind of where your paper was headed?
Yes.
Okay. So you had said you argued that Federalist number 78, which you look at the Federalist Papers as, from my understanding, is, you know, if government is the machine that runs the country, the Federalist Papers is the instruction manual, and the judiciary is the technical helpline, right? But you need that Federalist Papers. You're using the Federalist Papers as your instruction manual. And you argued, you said that in the Federalist Papers, particularly 78, I believe you had pointed out that the original sort of view was of the Supreme Court as this the last protector of democracy and the rule of law and all these sorts of things, right? Some would argue that that's never been the case, because, and I'm going to point this question out to you, is it possible to ever be completely objective? Can we really be objective?
Yeah, I think that kind of goes actually back to Sarah's argument that she pointed out about implicit bias. So I think like a cosmic level, or, you know, complete really subconscious level, anybody can ever truly be objective. But I think when it comes down to the nuts and bolts of things, the very the paper kind of stuff, the stuff in government that we can publish, we can look at under a microscope, we can be objective. Because it's not necessarily, we can say, oh, well, their argument was completely objective because they consciously thought this. It's more like how they got there is completely objective. Whereas a subjective way, yes, they're going to present reasonings for their argument, but you can kind of see places where they're obviously trying to pull things, manipulate things in a way to their bias, not necessarily that they're pointing out what is and what should be the case. And I kind of mentioned in the paper, I didn't mention the presentation, but things like Plessy v. Ferguson and things like that.
Yeah, you do. And so really what you're looking at doing is, and I have a feeling that you've maybe read some of the other Federalist Papers as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, my guess is because I feel like there's what you're really looking at is, okay, the ill is this idea of judicial ideology playing a role in judicial outcome, and the prescription is this bipartisan independent commission. So if the worry is that individual ideology is playing an important role or too much of a role in a Supreme Court's decision, what's to stop that same concern from arising regarding just another judicial commission to oversee the judiciary that we already have?
So I think the difference mainly, and I tried to point it out, is that this commission essentially has no power. I mean, the Supreme Court in a way only has as much power as the executive and legislative branch gives it on like influence their decisions and utilizing it. But a federal commission to overview it, of scholars that are appointed in a bipartisan way, they can't actually affect what the decision is going to be. So the decision is already going to be made at the Supreme Court, and they can't like strong arm the Supreme Court to act differently. All there essentially is going to show, they're going to point out the flow of the argument. So opinions, dissents. So essentially common people, you know, that the average citizen probably doesn't know how to read most legal documents, is probably not going to understand most things the Supreme Court justice is going to pen down about their arguments. They're going to point that out, and they'll point out discrepancies based on the supremacy clause. And that will factor into public image. And it's sort of a way not necessarily to force the Supreme Court to change what they decide. That's not the goal. They're not going to say whether a decision was right or wrong. They're just going to show if their methodology was proper under the parameters of Article 6, if that makes sense.
It does. So then if the ill is the perception of personal ideology taking, playing too much of a role in judicial decision, how would a commission that really has, as you said yourself, no real power actually have an effect on that? Can you explain that a little bit more?
Yeah, I think the main thing is because the Supreme Court can't control the power of the purse, they can't control war, those are relegated to the legislative and executive branches. Their main thing is interpreting the law, trying to influence things through their decisions, but in a way, from what I understood from a lot of my research, and at least the original intent of the Supreme Court, is that their word, they have like a final say on the law, but in a way their word isn't necessarily complete absolute law. As in, they can't just say something one day and expect the executive branch to immediately follow it. But because it has such a high public opinion, we would never think that anybody would go against a Supreme Court decision unless it had another case overturned it. So really what the commission is going to do is influence public image, because from how I personally see is most of the court's power does come from its legitimacy from the people. And I think that's my main concern, is that I personally think the Supreme Court, the justices, I really don't think we have much to worry about. And I don't think throughout its history we've had much to worry about. My main worry is that since we've seen lots of things like worry about demagogues rising to power, nationalism, isolationism, there's lots of these different kind of homegrown movements that are really populist in nature. And I'm worried they're going to manipulate that to try to say the court is not being impartial. So the federal commission would be a way to show, listen, this is how they got there. This is absolutely within the constitutional parameters. But they're not going to say, for example, if there's ever another court case brought against Roe v. Wade, they're not going to say whether the decision was right or wrong. They're just going to point out how they got there.
Okay. Yeah. And your statement that you made, where you just said the legitimacy of the Supreme Court is based upon the way that the citizenry views them. They're only as legitimate as the people view them. And this has been sort of an interesting thread that's cropped up to the surface in everybody's presentation. Going back for David, right, we're looking at EU as an institution. Ty, we talked about the importance of or the view of institutions as a different sort of lens of analysis, right? Sarah, we were talking about the prison system and the legal system as an institution. And now Cameron, we're right back, you're kind of back to that, right? That the legitimacy of the institution rests within the people. One thing I just want to ask, are you aware, I believe California has actually been doing this. They have a commission that oversees the state Supreme Court decisions.
No, I actually didn't know.
Okay. That might be something for you to take a look at. Yeah.
Okay.
That might strengthen your paper a little bit, because now you actually have, you can sort of justify your opinion because California is doing this. I think they've been doing this since like 1960. Take a look. But I'm not sure if there are other states. California is the one that jumps right to mind. So your paper was really good. I really liked it. Was really more an advocacy piece, advocating for a cure to an ill that I think everybody sort of feels is at the Supreme Court at times, right? Decisions being made based on personal ideology rather than the law. So to strengthen your paper, I would definitely take a look at California and see if there are any other states that are doing this at the state level. But I do know California, they do have a commission whose job is to take a look and review the Supreme Court decisions.
All right. Well, thank you. I'll look at that.
Yeah, you're very welcome. And last but not least, Anderson Miles. Anderson, you were looking at the January 6th commission, which again is the ultimate price we pay when we have a group of citizens that do not believe in the legitimacy of a specific institution, right? So I have a couple questions that I'd like to ask you. So first, I kind of want to go to really the heart of your argument. Your argument is violent protests are basically legitimate if evidence suggests or proves, we'll say, that an institution has failed. You're really taking a Lockean point of view. Violent protest is legitimate if the social contract has been broken. And it's those institutions that keep the social contract, or at least that the social contract works through. So my question to you is this: who decides that it's been broken?
You see, that is a great question, because I like that you talked about the Lockean point of view in there, because that was kind of like my focus a little bit with the two, because Locke suggested the same worry, like, okay, in the situation where the government is deemed illegitimate, what are the parameters of which we test it to see if it is? And that's the hard thing about this, to be honest. I mean, with a democratic institution like the United States, we have a clear history of it doing well at its job, in the sense that it's upheld the vote. It's done so. But to find evidence saying that it has not done its duty, like when Trump was calling for election fraud, what evidence do we really have? We don't have a lot of evidence to suggest that something did happen, where election fraud was a real thing that happened. So to answer your question, to be honest, I don't know the parameters for that. And I think that's something I really want to focus and delve into with further research, because this started out as a book idea. I had recently graduated from Cuba College a year early, and I had planned on writing this for my senior year, but given that I graduated early, I was like, oh, I don't know. But trying to find a job and everything has been difficult in the federal government. So, and going back to doctoral school. So this paper, this idea was something I've been working on for a long time, and to have the chance to present it now is amazing. But I'm going on a tangent. The point is, I don't have a direct answer as to how we're going to solve it, but something I really would like to delve into and explore more.
Yeah, it's hard, and I'm sympathetic to that, because really, but if the argument is that when the social contract has been broken, violent protest could be legitimate. Those people that stormed the Capitol, they believed the social contract was broken, which means their protest, according to that letter of the law, is legitimate. Which, of course, I agree with you, it certainly is not. But and on the other side of it, you were looking at both. You're looking at the differences sort of between conservative violent protests and liberal extreme protests, right? And this sort of connects back to Sarah and Ty. They're both. Sarah didn't directly look at the protests that we experienced just within the last couple of years, but Ty looked at the protests in Hong Kong. Sarah, your topic on the disproportionate arrest and conviction. Well, we just saw, based on police violence and brutality, a series of protests that broke out throughout the United States. I mean, I'm sitting here watching TV, watching cities burn, right? So again, it gets back to the idea, and those many on the left would argue that those protests, there was legitimate cause there in the way it was handled. Those on the right would disagree. Many on the right would agree that the DC protest was legitimate. Many on the left disagree. So really, isn't who legitimizes a violent protest or any protest? Isn't it just depending on what side you're on, what side of the aisle you're on ideologically?
I would say the reason I did conservative versus liberal was because I wanted to avoid a bias, because I align with myself towards the left of, I try to be moderate, but I have a left leaning. So my concern was that I would paint conservative ideology or even Republican ideology as being one that endorses violence. And that's not the case, as we've seen. I mean, I introduced the Weatherman Underground, and it's in my paper, but not in the presentation, Antifa, which is a liberal, a liberal organization that's destructured and basically uses the chat rooms to talk to others and be like, hey, who wants to go to this protest and counter protest the alt-right? So with that, I mean, ideology, certainly. I mean, with ideology, it's like if you're a liberal protester and look at the Capitol riots, you're going to say, oh, you know, those conservative oath keepers were trying to overthrow the United States government. Yeah, we're against that. And then if you were an oath keeper, you would say the same thing about the George Floyd protests. Like, well, yeah, they're burning cities. This is clearly not in line with conservative ideology. This is ridiculous. So at the end of the day, you're going to support a protest group is going to support what their ideology says. They're going to be like like I said, with the Capitol riots, liberals are going to be against that. If you're conservative, you're more likely against the George Floyd protest.
Yeah, and what was interesting, I thought one of the most powerful images that you showed in your PowerPoint, and it provided an interesting contrast between your paper versus this one image. So you had an image, it was of the civil rights movement, and it was white patrons pouring, looks like drinks, and harassing African Americans who were just sitting there peacefully, right?
Right.
Those images, for me, when I see those images, I don't have to ask myself who the victim is. I can see it.
Right.
Right. And that's where, and what's your opinion on this? Is that where violent protest falls apart? So for example, when the right was storming the Capitol, right? When I see those images, I don't have to know who the villains are. I can see it.
Right.
But the problem is even with the best of intentions, if we look back to say the George Floyd protests, what happened during, during that arrest, everybody who's at least rational thinking knows that that was an absolute tragedy that should never have happened. And the fact that we still have this conversation now is a tragedy. But if you show then the reaction of the looting, the burning down buildings, it could be argued then that that actually blurs the line, right, over who, is sort of right or wrong in the situation. Whereas in the peaceful protest, for example, again, that image that you showed with the white patrons dumping the drinks on, I don't need to question who's on the right side or wrong side of that. It's clear that the people who are harassing the patrons who are sitting there peacefully are the villains. So in that, so even given that, does violent protest delegitimize itself? Can violent protest harm the very thing that it's seeking to accomplish?
I think more than likely, I would say yes, it does harm what it's trying to do. I mean, I'm gonna have a bias because again, the setting I put this in for this paper is in the United
January
States.
6th. Yep, in the US.
January
Sure.
in the US. So naturally, as an American citizen, I have a stronger reason to say, oh, there's nothing really terribly wrong. It's just a matter of miscommunication. There's no real shadow government or there's no real bad guy here. It's just a miscommunication. But if you look at a country like Hungary or Russia or North Korea, where there are dictatorships and where there is evidence of guns being used on their own people and secret police coming to journalists' houses and abducting them in the middle of the night. That's why I kind of wrote and thought of, okay, maybe violent protests can be legitimate because at some point there comes a time where you do have to defend yourself. I mean, it's a horrible thing. Like no one wants to pick up a club and kill another person. I don't think that's the case. I think that they're just so afraid of what a government entity is going to do. Someone who has the power to take away your life and your existence in a snap. I mean, it's unimaginable here in the United States. So in the United States.
No, go ahead.
Okay. In the United States setting, I mean, it's easier to not sympathize with a violent protest. It's like, well, you have all these channels to communicate your thoughts, your grievances. If you don't like that there's potholes on your road, write your congressman. If you don't like how the police are handling something, you can go to your police department and talk to people. You can file a complaint. You can do these things. Does it always work? Absolutely not. I mean, democracy is slow for a reason. It's a hyper pluralist system where everyone has a problem. It's a big country. Everyone has a problem. And unfortunately, the problems that need to be taken care of aren't, because there's so many smaller problems that are being jammed up in there. But a dictatorship, it's one guy, and he says, and a court jester might say to him, hey, there's this problem with the LGBTQA community. What do you want to do with them? I don't know, shoot them. I mean, that's the end of the day. That's the end of the conversation. End of point of story.
Well,
And
and it's sure, and it's difficult too, because looking at again the January 6th insurrection that happened just shortly after the George Floyd protests, is even talking about those two in the same breath fair, right? One was an attempted insurrection overthrow of our entire government. One was a protest to try to address the same concern that's been going on in this country for how many years, right? And getting back to what you were saying, and again, in sort of, I don't ever defend violence, but if we want to argue, I think what you're saying is if you want to argue that violent protest is never legitimate, then we have to question the very founding of our own country that was born out of violent protest, right?
It's a difficult
That's
route.
something it's tough. So this is a really thought-provoking panel, and I want to thank all of you. And it was just really, my favorite part here, I think, was seeing all these sort of themes bubble up to the surface that each one of you addressed in your own interesting and unique way. And I think you all have a really bright future ahead of you. And there's a lot of, I think, government professionals and future doctorate students and master's students here. So thank you all for coming. Thank you all for your hard work, which you all put in. I could tell just by reading your papers. And your presentations, you all did a great job. So thank you so much. And I hope to see you next year presenting again at the conference. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Have a
Thank you
great
for this
weekend.
opportunity.
Sure. Thank you. For the
Thank you.
opportunity.
Happy Easter.
You too. You too.